He saved the life of the woman who tried to destroy his and never told her. Why? Because sometimes the loudest strength is silence. This isn't just a story about betrayal and family secrets. It's a journey about reclaiming your identity, healing without applause, and discovering that the most powerful redemption is the one no one sees coming. The silence in the room felt heavier than the dust floating through the late afternoon light. Elias Carter, age 33, stood alone in the cramped study of the man who had raised him in every way that mattered. The tang of old paper and cedar wood lingered in the air, woven into the fabric of his memory. Each inhale brought not just scent, but sentiment. His grandfather, Walter Carter, had passed away 3 days prior. The funeral had been a brief, quiet affair, efficient as his aunt called it. There had been no fanfare, no heartfelt eulogies, only trimmed-down rituals and handshakes in a room that felt too sterile. But for Elias, it had been a private unraveling. Not because of grief alone, but because Walter had been the only person in his life who ever made him feel seen. Now the study, filled with mismatched bookshelves, tinkering tools, handwritten notes, and ancient electrical parts, was the only place that still felt like home. Elias moved carefully, almost reverently, through the space, stacking papers, gently sorting through memories. There were boxes labeled in Walter's neat mechanical script: transistor experiments, weather radio logs, 1993, 2015, and L's first projects. His fingers hovered over that last one before he moved on. On the desk sat a cracked magnifying glass and a notebook filled with diagrams of solar-powered gadgets, as if Walter had been mid-thought and simply stepped out. Elias took a moment to sit in his grandfather's well-worn leather chair. He could almost hear the man's voice beside him explaining current resistance, with metaphors about rivers and rocks. His hand paused over a wooden drawer under the desk, where he found an envelope labeled in blocky, familiar handwriting. For Elias. He sat down slowly, the old chair creaking beneath him, and opened the letter. Ciao la diu tuit voi nyut ma jadin ne kombit kat iutung. The sentence stopped him cold. In the original it read, "You are the most wonderful thing this family never knew how to love." His breath caught. Not because it was a surprise, but because someone had finally said it out loud. Walter had always known. When Elias was a child, quiet, too bookish, too sensitive, he found safety in Walter's basement workshop, while the rest of the family laughed at Sunday brunches or showed off new degrees in business ventures. Elias and Walter soldered radio circuits, talked about solar energy, and read popular science magazines aloud. Elias still remembered the first time he fixed something with his own hands, a broken transistor radio. Walter had ruffled his hair and said, "You see, boy, the world may not understand you, but you can build a world of your own." There was a photo tacked to the corkboard on the wall, Elias at 10, grinning awkwardly, holding up a lopsided robot made of soda cans and wires. Walter had insisted on celebrating that project, like a graduation. Elias blinked, returning to the present. He folded the letter with care, tucking it back into the envelope like something sacred. It was the only acknowledgement he had ever received that he wasn't the problem. Outside the study, the rest of the house bustled with the cleanup of mourning. Amanda, his older sister by name but not by heart, coordinated with florists and caterers like a corporate executive. She hadn't cried. She hadn't even flinched when Elias delivered Walter's eulogy. Her handshake afterward had been cold, businesslike. He hadn't expected warmth, not from Amanda, not from his father, who had kept a quiet, polite distance throughout the day, nor from his stepmother, who had once told Elias he was too fragile to be a proper man. Even as a child, Elias knew he was different, not in the way people said it with pride, but in the way people said it with warning. He cried during classical music, flinched at raised voices, preferred libraries to playgrounds. He didn't like confrontation, and in this family, confrontation was sport. Walter had once told him, "You don't have to roar to be heard. Sometimes the quiet ones build the tallest towers." Returning to his own apartment that night, Elias placed the letter in the top drawer of his writing desk. His apartment was sparse white walls, metal shelves lined with academic journals, and a half-completed Arduino project, sitting idle on the kitchen counter. He poured himself a glass of water, opened his laptop to clear his inbox, and there it was, a message flagged with urgent priority from the Research Ethics Board. Subject: temporary suspension of research access body. Due to a breach in data security involving proprietary files from the experimental hematopoietic project. Your access to the research servers has been suspended pending investigation. Please be advised that Amanda Wells was the last verified user under your login credentials. Elias stared at the screen. For a long moment he did not move. He read the email again, then a third time. The words stayed the same. His login credentials. Amanda. His project under investigation. He leaned back in his chair, a slow breath escaping him. Above the desk, the wall clock ticked louder than it should have. In the kitchen, the refrigerator hummed. After several minutes, Elias whispered to the empty room. Of course it was her. He closed the laptop, reached for his grandfather's letter, and held it again, not as a memory, but as a shield. And so it began. Elias had always known what it meant to be the afterthought, the extra, the space filler in a family photo. But it wasn't until he was 8 years old that the realization solidified into a memory so sharp it would follow him into adulthood. They were on their way to the lake house. Summer air buzzed through open windows, mixing the scent of pine with fried food wrappers and perfume. Amanda, 3 years older, sat in the front seat between their father and stepmother, giggling at something on the car radio. Elias, carrying his science kit and an illustrated guide to birds, arrived at the door of the car too late. "No more room," his stepmother said without turning around, "but you can take the other car with the staff." That was the beginning of the empty chairs, the unspoken, invisible boundaries that told Elias, this seat isn't for you. This table isn't set for you. This moment isn't meant for you. From birthdays where his name was misspelled on the cake to family dinners where no one noticed he wasn't served dessert. The pattern continued. It wasn't overt cruelty. It was absence. The kind that made a boy question if he had been imagined. Amanda, in contrast, was light itself. Her laughter filled hallways. Her photos were in every frame. She played piano at family parties, gave poised answers at school interviews, and had their father's full attention with a single glance. Elias watched from doorways, clutching library books like life vests. One afternoon, he broke a vase. A minor accident, a clumsy elbow while reaching for a journal. Amanda walked in right after the crash. Their stepmother appeared seconds later. No questions were asked. "Elias," she snapped. "Why are you always ruining things?" Amanda said nothing, just tilted her head and looked away. Elias cleaned up the shards in silence, but Walter noticed. "Tell me what happened," his grandfather asked later that day. They were in the garage, the hum of a ceiling fan turning slowly overhead. Elias hesitated, then mumbled the truth. Walter said nothing for a long time, then handed Elias a screwdriver. "Let's take apart something that doesn't matter and build something that does." That summer, they built a solar-powered weather vane. It didn't work well, but Elias never forgot the joy of being trusted. Walter, with his patient voice and rough hands, made space where others closed doors. He encouraged Elias to write poetry even when the words didn't rhyme. He taught him how to repot dying plants and how to decode Morse code. Most of all, he listened not as an adult pretending to be interested, but as a man who saw value in a quiet boy. On Elias's 10th birthday, Walter gave him a journal and said, "Fill it only with things that matter to you. Not what you think people want, just you." Elias filled it with sketches of circuit boards, lines of poetry, and diagrams of the night sky. It was his first real possession. Years later, Elias could still remember how that felt. He could also remember the birthday dinner that same night when Amanda got a new dress and 3 gifts from relatives. Elias got one card in Walter's journal. One winter, Elias caught the flu and missed school for a week. No one asked how he was until Walter showed up with a thermos of soup and a worn-out copy of Jules Verne. "You look like a boy who needs an adventure," Walter had said. It wasn't that his father hated him. It was worse, he saw right through him. Elias became skilled at making himself smaller, quieter. He learned not to interrupt, not to expect, not to hope. The ache was subtle, growing like ivy over the architecture of his heart. Back in the present, Elias sat alone at his kitchen table holding a mug of coffee gone cold. His grandfather's letter still lay open in the drawer nearby, and the hum of the refrigerator underscored the quiet like a metronome. He looked up at the empty chairs across from him. Not metaphorical ones, actual wooden chairs unoccupied. A dinner table with settings for 2 used only by 1. Memory like gravity pulled him backward. He was 14, the family had hosted a garden party, string lights, hors d'oeuvres, speeches about legacy and excellence. Elias had been asked to stay inside and not embarrass anyone. Walter snuck him a plate of appetizers and said, "Sometimes families build fences where they should plant trees." Elias never forgot that line, and now in the stillness of adulthood with credentials and awards and an apartment full of silence, he wondered whether those empty chairs had shaped him more than anything else. He stood, walked to his bookshelf, and found the old journal. Inside the front cover, in Walter's handwriting, "Family isn't blood. It's who saves you a seat without being asked." Elias closed the book and whispered, "Thank you." And for the first time in days, he let himself cry. Not because of grief, but because someone had once made room for him. Someone had said without saying it, "You matter." And that was enough for now. It began without warning, as most quakes do. Elias had just settled into his morning routine, coffee steeping in a French press, his laptop whirring to life, an ambient playlist humming in the background. The calm of his apartment offered a rare sanctuary. He had even considered taking the afternoon off to visit the botanical gardens Walter loved. But the email came first. Subject: Administrative Update Board Appointment. The message was short, a clinical notice from the partner hospital announcing Amanda Wells as the newest member of their Executive Research Oversight Board. Elias stared at the screen, the mug in his hand, paused mid-air. Amanda, at his institution, overseeing projects like his own. The name felt like an echo from a hallway he'd long since sealed off. In the days that followed, Amanda made her presence known. She swept through boardrooms in tailored suits, asked pointed questions during research briefings, and introduced a new compliance protocol that required retroactive reviews of all data sharing processes. At first, Elias tried to keep his distance. Their interactions remained cordial, professional, distant. Amanda acted as if their shared history was a minor clerical note, something to be filed away and forgotten. But then came the breach. Elias had been working on a cutting-edge stem cell regeneration trial, a project built over 5 years of painstaking data simulations and pilot treatments. The findings, still unpublished, were stored on encrypted drives with limited access, until they weren't. A week after Amanda's appointment, a competing hospital across the state submitted a proposal to the NIH that mirrored Elias's findings nearly word for word. Identical sequencing patterns, matching therapeutic models. Even the phrasing in the abstract was familiar. He read the leaked document in disbelief. He had never shared those drafts outside his immediate lab, the only administrative login that had accessed the folder during the breach his. Except Elias hadn't logged in that night. The internal investigation was swift and cold. It ran trace logs. The legal team contacted his department chair. His access was suspended pending review. No formal charges, no accusations. But the message was clear: something was wrong, and he was the likeliest culprit. Amanda, of course, expressed deep regret at the situation. In a meeting room with too much glass and not enough air, she offered a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "I hope we can resolve this quickly. It's unfortunate when things like this distract from real work," she said. Elias said nothing. He just nodded. He knew that any protest would sound like deflection. Outside the room, his reputation began to unravel. Colleagues avoided eye contact, emails were left unanswered, invitations to collaborate quietly disappeared. Elias felt the weight of suspicion settle over him like wet wool. He spent hours combing through access logs, encryptions, timestamps. Nothing pointed conclusively to Amanda. Nothing proved anything. He had no evidence, just a gnawing certainty in his chest. Each night he returned to the apartment more drained than the last. The walls, once silent and calming, now seemed to echo with his own doubt. Was it her? Was he being paranoid? Could it have been someone else, or worse? Was there some flaw in his process that made the breach possible? The questions clawed at him. He thought of Walter. His grandfather would have said, "Truth has gravity, Eli. Even when buried, it pulls." But Elias wasn't sure gravity would help him here. He wasn't even sure truth mattered to the kind of people who built ladders from lies. One night he sat at his kitchen table, the same one with the empty chairs, and opened the old journal Walter had given him. Inside he found a page he hadn't read in years. "If they steal your voice, write louder. If they doubt your worth, build things they can't touch." That line stayed with him, not because it offered comfort, but because it was the only anchor he had left. He wouldn't fight Amanda. Not yet, not publicly. But he would not let her erase him either. He began documenting everything, every interaction, every system log, every pattern of movement on the server. He built a timeline not for vindication, but for clarity. If the ground was shaking, he wanted to know where the fault lines were. And through it all, he said nothing. No complaints, no emails, no dramatic confrontations in boardrooms. He showed up. He stayed late. He nodded when others looked away. And he waited. Because sometimes survival wasn't in making noise. Sometimes it was in standing still long enough to let the dust settle and see who ran first. Elias wasn't a victim. He was an observer. And observers, he knew, always noticed the aftershocks before anyone else. The phone call came on a Wednesday morning, just as Elias was reorganizing his home office. It was the kind of call that reshuffled the boundaries of everything he thought he knew. "Mr. Carter, this is the National Bone Marrow Registry. We've identified you as the only viable match for a patient in critical need." He straightened in his chair. "Who is the recipient?" The voice on the other end paused. "For privacy reasons, we cannot share specific details, but the initials listed are AW, and the case has been flagged as urgent." AW Amanda Wells. Elias froze. His brain performed a slow, stuttering loop as if trying to reject what already understood. He was the match for Amanda. Same woman who had sabotaged his work and stood by, his reputation crumbled, who had once looked through him like he was air. And now his marrow was the only thing that could save her life. "We'd like to schedule a follow-up consultation," the caller continued. "Time is of the essence." Elias managed to agree, his voice sounding like someone else's. He hung up numb. He sat there for a long time, staring at nothing. Outside the window, the city moved along indifferently. Buses wheezed by. Pedestrians passed under awnings. Life continued, utterly unaware that something tectonic had just shifted in his world. It wasn't just the request, it was the implication. If he was the only match, then what did that say about their genetics? How close were they really? He pulled out his birth certificate, a copy kept in the back of a file drawer for years. He had never examined it closely, there had never been a reason to. But now, under a desk lamp, the inconsistencies stood out like bruises. The date of registration was smudged, barely legible. The hospital name was missing, and under mother's name, there was a single initial M. No full name, no signature. He scanned the document twice more, heart accelerating. Something was wrong, or rather, something had always been wrong, and now it was surfacing. His fingers moved faster than his thoughts. He pulled out a small metal box from the closet, Walter's old safe. Inside, among vintage radio parts and a tarnished pocket watch, was a list of contacts Walter had always kept updated. One name stood out: Donald Kessler, attorney at law. Walter's longtime lawyer, the man who handled his will, his estate, everything. Within an hour, Elias was in his car driving across town. The law office was a converted colonial home tucked between two modern condos. Time seemed slower there. Dust motes drifted in beams of warm light. The receptionist greeted him with a familiarity that reminded him of old library clerks. "Mr. Carter," said Kessler when he entered. The lawyer was older now, thinner, with deeper lines around his mouth, but his voice still held its crisp cadence. "I was wondering if you might show up one day. Your grandfather left something for you." Elias felt the air shift. Kessler unlocked a cabinet behind his desk and pulled out a sealed envelope, yellowed with time and bearing Walter's unmistakable handwriting. "To Elias, when the truth is ready to be known." "He gave it to me nearly 30 years ago," Kessler said. "Said you'd know when the moment came." Elias held the envelope with trembling fingers. For a brief second he considered tearing it open right there, but something in him said no, not yet. The truth could wait a little longer. He needed space clarity, not just facts. He needed to be ready to receive the truth, not just read it. He stood, thanked Kessler, and walked outside. The sun was low, casting long shadows over the sidewalk. Elias felt its warmth on his face, but couldn't shake the chill deep inside. He slid the envelope into his coat pocket. Amanda's life, his life, everything was tangled now. And somewhere behind sealed paper and years of silence was the thread that might finally untangle it all. But for now, all he could do was hold it. A man carrying two lives, one known, one waiting to be discovered. Elias waited until midnight to open the envelope. He sat at the small table by his window, the same place he drank coffee and reviewed research notes. But tonight the journal lay untouched. Instead, in his hands was 30 years of silence, wrapped in a fading paper seal. He peeled it open slowly, deliberately. Inside were several documents: a hospital birth certificate different from the one he'd known, a letter in a woman's flowing script, and a lab report marked in red ink. Genetic confirmation, paternity match. His eyes skipped between the lines, his mind struggling to catch up. The certificate named his mother as Mara L. Rivera. No father was listed. The DNA report confirmed that Elias was the biological son of Gregory Carter, his father, and Mara Rivera. The date matched exactly to his birthday. The woman who had raised him with cool detachment had not given birth to him. Mara had, and the letter, its ink faded but still legible, bore Mara's handwriting. "To my son Elias. If you are reading this, it means you are old enough to ask questions, old enough to face the truth I never had the chance to tell you. I was 17 when I came to the Carter household. I worked there to send money home to my mother. I never meant to fall in love with your father, and he never meant to betray his wife. But you were born of that mistake, and to me you were never a mistake. I loved you, with every beat of my heart, but complications from the delivery took me away from you. Walter, your grandfather, promised to protect you, and I trust he did. If the world has ever made you feel unloved, unwanted, it wasn't because you weren't worthy. It was because the truth was too hard for others to bear. But now it is yours to hold. Live freely, my son. You were born not in shame, but in love. Elias read the letter 3 times. By the end, his hands trembled. Mara, his mother, a girl who had worked for his family, who had loved him, who had died giving birth to him, and Walter, his grandfather, had kept it all hidden, not out of shame, but out of protection. The envelope, the letter, the documentation, they were not secrets, they were safeguards, a quiet vault of love left intact until Elias was strong enough to unlock it. His mind wandered to every memory, the odd way his stepmother always called him. That boy. The way his father avoided prolonged conversations, the way Amanda's contempt burned hotter than sibling rivalry. He wasn't her brother. He wasn't even supposed to be part of the family. At least not in the eyes of those who built their lives on reputation and image. He needed to see her. Mara. The cemetery was small and quiet, tucked behind a community chapel. Kessler had included the plot number with the letter as if Walter had anticipated this pilgrimage. A light rain fell as Elias arrived, soft as whispers. He found the headstone easily. Mara L. Rivera, 1970 to 1992. Beloved daughter. Brave mother. No flowers, no visitors. Just the gravestone and the scent of damp earth. Elias crouched beside it, brushing off leaves with slow hands. "Hi," he said softly. "I don't know if you can hear me, but I found you." He sat for a long while, speaking quietly, telling her about the man he had become. The man who had been made to feel like a stranger in his own home. The boy who loved science, who fixed radios, who wrote poetry in the margins of textbooks. He cried, not out of grief, but because for the first time in his life, he felt like he belonged to someone. He placed a hand on the stone and whispered, "I'm yours, and you were mine, even if we never had time." As the rain fell harder, Elias stood and tucked the letter into his coat. He turned back once before walking away. A chapter had closed, but it hadn't shut him in. It had opened him up to a new truth, a new name, a new meaning of family. And for the first time, Elias didn't feel like he was surviving. He felt like he was beginning. Elias had never intended to return to the Carter estate. The place held too many shadows, and not the kind that faded with time. But after Mara's letter, after her name etched into stone had finally rooted him in something real, he knew he had to face what remained of his old world. Not for reconciliation, he no longer needed that, but for recognition. He called ahead. Amanda answered, her voice clipped and unsurprised. "So you finally figured it out," she said. No emotion, no welcome, just an edge sharpened by years of disdain. When Elias arrived, the mansion looked the same, pristine, manicured hollow. Inside, the walls were lined with family portraits in oil and gold. He had never appeared in any of them. In the parlor, Amanda, their father, Gregory, and Margaret, the woman who had raised him, sat as though waiting for a verdict. The air felt heavier than the storm outside. He stood before them, envelope in hand, the truth of his origin sealed and unsealed within him now. "I know," Elias said simply. "Everything. About Mara, about the DNA, about why I never fit in." Gregory shifted uncomfortably. Margaret's mouth tightened into a line. Amanda looked at him like he was something under her shoe. "That woman was a mistake," Margaret said coldly. "You were the consequence, a stain we worked hard to keep from spreading." Gregory added nothing. He didn't deny it. He didn't apologize. He simply looked away. Amanda's voice cut through the silence like glass. "I don't want your pity. I don't want your marrow. I don't want anything from a man who doesn't even have a family." Elias stared at her, so poised, so composed, yet so full of inherited cruelty. He had come expecting silence or denial, but not this level of contempt, not this blatant dismissal of his existence. He nodded slowly, then he stepped back, standing straighter than he ever had in that house. "I'm not here for your thanks or your forgiveness. I'm not even here to argue." His voice was steady, quiet, like the calm before a storm. "I just needed to say this. I don't need your acceptance. I needed to know that I wasn't a mistake, that I wasn't the consequence of someone's shame." His gaze swept across the room. "And now I know I was loved once, by the woman who gave me life. That's enough." He turned to leave. No one called after him. The rain hit his face as he stepped outside, but he didn't flinch. Every step away from the mansion felt lighter. He had carried their silence for too long. Now he walked with his own truth, and it didn't need their permission to matter. The storm had passed, but the sky remained overcast as Elias returned home. He hadn't spoken to anyone about what happened at the estate. He wasn't ready, not even for Martin, the one person he trusted enough to see the parts of him he rarely showed. That evening, Elias found himself in his lab long after hours, surrounded by the low hum of cooling units and rows of petri dishes. He stared blankly at a sample under a microscope, but his mind was far from cellular structures. Could he save Amanda? Should he? She had been part of the machine that tried to erase him. She had watched him fall and hadn't flinched. And yet biology had tethered them in a cruel, ironic twist. His marrow might be the only thing that could keep her alive. The dilemma wasn't about forgiveness. Elias didn't feel anger anymore, not in the way he once had. What he felt now was weight, the gravity of choice. He wasn't bound by obligation nor moved by revenge. What lingered was something deeper, the memory of a promise made by someone no longer living. That night he reached out to Martin. They met at a quiet diner outside the city where the clatter of cutlery could buffer any silence between them. Elias didn't start with pleasantries. "They want my marrow," he said. Martin blinked. "You mean Amanda?" Elias nodded. Martin leaned back. "And you're asking yourself why you should—" "Not exactly," Elias said. "I'm asking if doing it in silence still counts, if doing something good without recognition is still powerful." Martin stirred his coffee. "Isn't that the only kind of power that matters?" They sat for a while, sipping coffee. Elias finally broke the quiet. "I keep hearing my grandfather's voice. He used to say, 'Strength isn't about shouting. It's about keeping your heart intact when no one's watching.'" Martin smiled. "Sounds like a wise man." "He was the only one who ever saw me," Elias said. "And I think he'd want me to do this, but on my terms." The next morning, Elias contacted the National Bone Marrow Registry. "I'll donate," he told the coordinator. "That's wonderful news, Mr. Carter. We'll start the pre-screening." "One condition," Elias interrupted. "Anonymity. I want the recipient to live, but I don't want her to know it came from me. Not now, not ever." The coordinator hesitated. "That's unusual, but not impossible. Are you sure?" "Absolutely." He hung up and felt an odd lightness, not victory, not vindication, just peace. He filled out the forms, signed the waivers, went through the medical clearances. During recovery, Martin visited, bringing books and podcasts and irreverent jokes. Elias laughed more that week than he had in months. Amanda never knew. The Marrow arrived at the hospital under a code number, escorted by couriers, and logged into systems that never touched his name. He had given her a future, and he had done it as a free man, not bound by guilt, not seeking approval, but choosing fully to act out of his own moral clarity. That, Elias thought, was the difference between being a survivor and becoming whole. The surgery was successful. Amanda's body accepted the transplant with minimal complications. The marrow grafted and her immune system began to rebuild itself. In the weeks that followed, she slowly regained strength. There were quiet notes in her chart, white blood cell count stabilizing, platelet production resuming. Life, it seemed, had found a way to persist. There were also whispers. Among the hospital staff, through the halls of the research institute, even in the break room corners, someone had stepped forward. A donor. Perfect match. Anonymous. A miracle. The Carter family sent a formal letter through the Transplant Coordination Center. It arrived in a plain envelope addressed simply to the donor. Inside was a printed note, unsigned, sterile in tone. We wish to express our deepest gratitude to the individual whose selfless act saved Amanda's life. We may never know your name, but your kindness will not be forgotten. Elias read it once, lips barely moving. He smiled faintly. Then, without ceremony, he folded the letter and placed it in the bottom drawer of his desk beside the envelope from Amanda. He hadn't done this for their thanks. He hadn't done this for redemption. He had done it because he could. Because for once in his life, his choices belonged entirely to him. Weeks passed, then months. Elias returned to work, reclaiming his corner of the lab like a quiet gardener returning to a forgotten plot. His colleagues remained courteous but distant. The scandal had faded, but reputations took longer to heal. He didn't mind. He resumed his research with a new rhythm, slower, more intentional. He began mentoring a junior fellow, hosted a small ethics seminar on campus, and revived an old grant proposal long thought defunct. Martin visited often. Their conversations now meandered beyond lab notes into books, philosophy, the structure of resilience. "You're turning into some kind of monk," Martin joked one evening, holding up a tea mug Elias had handed him. "All this serenity, it's unnerving." Elias laughed. Maybe serenity's just exhaustion in disguise. But it wasn't. Something in him had changed. And then came Amanda's withdrawal. The internal memo arrived on a rainy Thursday. Amanda Wells had officially resigned from the oversight board. Her statement was brief, formal, free of drama. She acknowledged past decisions that may have compromised the clarity of leadership and cited a need to focus on personal health. Elias read the memo twice. He felt no vindication. Only quiet confirmation. She had stepped down. Whether by choice or pressure, it didn't matter. What mattered was that her presence had retreated like a storm finally blown out to sea. Later that week, colleagues mentioned that Amanda had also issued personal notes to staff members. Apologies, shorthand written acknowledgments of missteps and unintended harm. Elias wasn't sure if any of it was sincere, but he wasn't looking for sincerity. That same Friday evening, a letter appeared at his doorstep, no return address. But he recognized the handwriting instantly. Amanda. He sat at the table for over an hour, the letter in his hands unopened. He traced the edge with his thumb. He imagined what was inside. Confessions, explanations, requests for forgiveness. In the end, he slid the envelope into the drawer, next to the thank you note, both of them resting there like artifacts from a life he had once fought to belong to. He didn't open the letter. He didn't need to. What he had done freely, without witness, without demand. He had acted not as a martyr, but as a man who had reclaimed his power. And for the first time, Elias felt unshakably whole. Not because someone else had validated him, But because he had finally stopped waiting to be seen, the world could keep its applause. He had already heard the only voice that mattered, his own. Elias didn't leave in anger. He didn't leave to make a statement or to vanish dramatically from the lives of those who had once dismissed him. He left because for the first time he could, without needing permission, explanation, or a tidy goodbye. He moved to Oregon, to a small town, tucked between forest and sky. It was a place where the air smelled of pine and rain, and the days moved with a kind of slow, deliberate grace. The town had no traffic lights, no pretensions, just community gardens, a co-op grocery store, and coffee shops where strangers smiled and remembered your name. There at the edge of a quiet valley, Elias began working with the Cascade Independent Research Institute, and a small but respected nonprofit focused on regenerative medicine. It was the kind of place where curiosity outweighed hierarchy and breakthroughs came without boardroom applause. His new lab was modest, stripped of institutional grandeur, but filled with collaboration and purpose. Researchers moved with an ease that Elias hadn't seen in years, driven not by competition but by quiet conviction. There were no polished corridors echoing ambition. Just scientists, thinkers, and dreamers, each committed to their work because they believed in the questions more than the credit. Elias felt at home in the quiet. He rented a small cedar cabin with wide windows and a sloping garden out back. The land was soft with moss, wildflowers crept into corners, and birds nested in the eaves. One weekend he planted a tree, the same species his grandfather had once taught him to cultivate, a black walnut, long-limbed and patient. He remembered the way Walter used to say, "You plant it not for yourself, but for the shade you'll never sit in." Elias found the gesture healing. His hands in the soil, his breath steady, his mind uncluttered by questions of legacy or worth. He began sketching again, something he hadn't done since college. Leaves, insects, roots spreading quietly beneath the earth. At night, he'd sit on the porch, wrapped in a wool blanket, a mug of tea in hand, and read old letters, especially the one from Mara. He read it not to mourn, but to remember. Her words, so full of hope and sorrow, anchored him to something unbreakable. He was hers, and that truth, once buried, had blossomed into a sense of belonging deeper than biology. Through Mara's letter, he found the courage to reach out to her sister, Lucia. He had hesitated, unsure if he was trespassing into a past best left undisturbed. But Lucia responded with warmth and joy. "I always wondered what became of you," she told him during their first call. "Mara would have been so proud." They spoke often after that. Lucia sent photos of Mara as a child, shared stories of a girl who loved to dance barefoot in the rain, who wrote poems on napkins and dreamed of studying marine biology. "She was terrified when she found out she was pregnant," Lucia said one evening. "But she was braver than anyone I've known. She loved you even before she met you, even when she knew she might not survive." Elias listened, absorbing each word like water to roots. There were tears, yes, but they didn't sting. They washed something clean. Something in him softened, not in a way that dulled his edge, but in a way that let the light in. He no longer needed to rewrite the past. He didn't need the Carter name or the approval he had chased for so long. He had found another kind of inheritance, memory, courage, truth. The kind that didn't show up in bank accounts or family crests, but lived instead in quiet conversations and weathered letters. There were days he still wrestled with questions, what ifs, old echoes of rejection. But they no longer controlled him. They drifted in and out like morning fog, leaving room for something steadier. He had stopped looking for closure and started seeking presence. He spent weekends teaching biology workshops to local students, sometimes drawing parallels between cellular repair and human resilience. "Healing doesn't mean forgetting," he told them once. "It means returning to yourself with more space inside." He gardened, he read, he hiked trails alone and with friends he was slowly making. He sent Lucia handwritten letters, the kind that traveled slower but arrived with more weight. He sketched Mara's face from memory and framed it above his desk. And that's what Elias had done. He hadn't gone back to fix anything. He had simply moved forward, not out of need but from choice, and in that he found the kind of peace he'd once thought belonged only to other people, a life that no longer needed to be earned, just lived. He wasn't healed because someone apologized or recognized his worth. He was healing because he had finally chosen himself, and that he knew would always be enough. The auditorium was quieter than Elias had expected. Hundreds of people filled the room, the buzz of their whispers subsiding as the lights dimmed. The National Conference on Biomedical Ethics was known for its sharp minds and sharper debates. Yet today the crowd had gathered not for a policy overhaul or a new research revelation, but to hear a story. His story. Elias stepped onto the stage slowly, the microphone adjusted to his height. He didn't bring slides or data sets. Only a small note card tucked in his pocket, more for comfort than necessity. "Good afternoon." He began, his voice steady but low. "I'm Elias Carter. I'm here to talk about anonymity, not just in clinical trials or donor registries, but in identity and healing and dignity." He paused, allowing the words to settle. His speech, titled "The Quiet Donor," was not a recounting of his personal history in full. He never named Amanda, never spoke of betrayals or inheritances. Instead, he painted the broader canvas of those who choose to act with integrity even when no recognition follows. Of people who are forced to redefine family, home, and worth outside of traditional lines. "There's a misconception," he said at one point, "that doing good must be loud to matter, that justice only counts if it's televised. But the truth is, many of the most transformative choices happen in silence." He told them about a boy who never quite belonged, who was taught science not in school but in the quiet corners of a grandfather's shed. About choosing to save a life without asking for gratitude. About planting trees whose shade he would never sit beneath. He spoke about how healing was not a destination but a constant choice, and how forgiveness does not always require reconciliation. He told them that kindness could be powerful even when no one clapped, and that some identities are shaped in solitude, not spotlight. And finally, he told them this: "I used to think I was a collection of what others said about me. A mistake, a secret, a footnote in someone else's narrative. But I've come to understand that we are not the names others give us. We are the names we choose to answer to." Silence followed, a full, aching, respectful silence. When the applause came, it was thunderous, but Elias didn't linger. He shook hands politely, thanked the organizers, and slipped out the side door as others queued up to talk. In the days that followed, his speech went viral. Someone had recorded it, he hadn't noticed who. Excerpts appeared in articles, then journals. One major psychology magazine ran a feature titled "The Ethics of the Quiet Hero." Elias received hundreds of messages, from students, researchers, survivors, people who felt seen perhaps for the first time. He responded to a few, but not all. Not because he didn't care, but because he understood that the story now belonged to others too. A professor in Germany wrote to say she was using his speech in her ethics class. A young man from Detroit shared that he had donated anonymously and finally felt proud, not erased. A woman who had never met her biological family wrote simply, "I cried. Thank you for telling me I exist." Back home in Oregon, life resumed its gentle rhythm. The black walnut tree had begun to take root. He spent afternoons walking the trail behind his cabin, sketchbook in hand. Lucia sent a package with more letters from Mara, teenage poems, fragments of lullabies she had never sung. The woods near his home became his sanctuary. Every bend in the trail reminded him of choices of branches not taken, of resilience growing in unexpected soil. He read, gardened, mentored, and lived with the grace of someone who no longer needed to prove anything. One evening, Elias stood in the clearing beside his home. The sun filtered through the trees, casting long golden beams across the mossy earth. Birds sang low in the branches. He inhaled deeply, feeling the air fill every part of him. A breeze moved the leaves above like whispers. And then, as if to no one but the forest, he said, "We are not who they say we are. We are who we choose to become." The words didn't need an audience. He wasn't a martyr. He wasn't a victim. He was a storyteller now, a quiet one whose story had already begun healing others even as it continued to heal himself. And in that silence, under the rustle of branches and the warm hush of dusk, Elias Carter finally wholly belonged.